may be out of sight for the summer, but that doesn't mean it's out of mind. This spring, after 10 years of state oversight, Holyoke schools are leaving receivership. They were one of the earliest Massachusetts districts to be placed under state control for chronic underperformance, but the politics around and our understanding of the actual effectiveness of receivership have shifted over the decade. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. And as this Pioneer Valley district begins to unwind from state control, I am delighted to be joined by my executive editor, Michael Jonas, to take us back to 2015 and look ahead at the next chapter. Michael Jonas, thank you for being here with me.
Great to be here.
So we're going to be talking a lot about the different ways that state receivership looks in practice. And in very, very loose terms, of course, this is when the state is basically taking on an oversight role into a specific district or a specific regional school system. But what's most important from your view, having covered this for more than a decade at this point, for people to know about the way that school receivership works in Massachusetts?
Well, I think the most important thing to think about is that this is sort of a superpowered authority of the state coming in to a local school district and essentially usurping the power of local officials to run the schools. Now, that can be a bad thing from a local official's point of view, or in the state's view, a sort of last-ditch necessary move for schools that have been struggling for some time. So the receivership really is a power that the state has in a law that was passed about 15 years ago that allows them to exercise this authority in sort of the most distressed school districts in the state after a number of steps have been taken leading up to the decision to put a district in receivership.
So what are the things that the state is looking at when it's starting to make that decision in a general sense? Because then we'll get into kind of specific case studies.
Sure. So, the fundamental thing the state is looking at is student achievement. There are a lot of other measures that the state takes of how schools are performing and districts are performing. But at the end of the day, the law that actually authorized this was not for nothing known as the Achievement Gap Act. And so it was a law that had a lot of elements to it, but all of them were centered on this fact that we have districts, struggling to get students up to proficiency, basically, in basic skills in math and English, generally based on how they perform on the state standardized test, the MCAS. So that has kind of been the measuring stick used in most of these cases to make a decision for receivership.
So we're talking about a certain level of underperformance or less than optimal achievement, but is there a specific point at which these schools end up being essentially handed over to the state, or is it a little bit wobblier than that?
It's a little wobblier. There's not a fixed cut point below which a score would put a district in danger of receivership. But I think to make the point, these are districts like Holyoke that have, the performance levels are extraordinarily low. These are places where, well under half of the kids are proficient. It could be as little as 20% of kids or even fewer are at basically sort of doing math or reading at grade level. And the other thing that the state has looked at is the degree to which a district doesn't seem to be getting any traction and changing that. So the kind of term they use for districts that are then at risk of going into receivership are those that have been deemed chronically underperforming. So it's been a persistent problem that the state has identified and that other measures short of receivership, the state authorities, state education officials feel haven't moved the needle.
And so we're kind of putting, maybe we're not closing the book on, but maybe we're moving to a next chapter of a story that's actually been in place since 2003, when Holyoke was apparently the first district to be declared underperforming. But you started really covering this, kind of checking in on a regular basis, starting a decade ago in 2015, when the state looked at the kind of lack of improvement that the districts had been seeing and said, we need to make moves toward receivership. So take me back a decade, Michael. What was the calculus? What were they looking at? What was Holyoke struggling with that made the case to the state, at least, for receivership?
I mean, I think it was sort of twofold. One was, again, they were looking at test scores and student achievement, but in Holyoke, as was the case in Lawrence, the district that was the first in the state to be put in receivership under this law, there was a level of what I think state officials would call dysfunction in the management of the school. So it was sort of a two-pronged problem that students were performing really poorly, and the state felt that whether it was kind of bureaucratic infighting and inability of the school committee working together with the school department leadership to get things on track, that there was kind of there was a governance issue as well. And so it's the connection of kind of governance and student achievement that receivership is, at least in theory, aimed at addressing, because you're kind of sweeping out the local governing authority, the school committee, and the local superintendent in favor of a state appointed official who has really broad powers to make decisions about the schools. So that was really the state of play in 2015 when the then state education commissioner Mitchell Chester made the decision to put Holyoke into receivership. It was not received well there, but he was he was sort of unapologetic in sort of his formulation, which was that the kids come first, and the kids in Holyoke are not doing well, and if this kind of offends the sensibilities of the local adults, that's not something that he was going to put too much stock in, given the situation.
And Holyoke and Lawrence, of course, so two of these cities that we've talked about a lot in terms of their kind of general educational outcomes and the struggles that they've had, also have things in common in terms of kind of the underlying financial situation of the towns and the demographics of the towns, history of being low-income communities. So how was that factoring into these decisions? Was the idea that they were doing their best, but their best wasn't good enough? Or was the idea that they should be able to do more with what they had?
Well, I mean, I think that the state did feel, I mean, Chester, as the state education leader at the time, and others, were often fond of saying that, like, that the demographics of a district, should not sort of determine or be thought of as determining the destiny of these kids. So they understood that these were districts with high levels of poverty and students facing a lot of other challenges. They also, as you say, took funding. They did not have the kind of school funding that a lot of wealthier districts have. And so critics often of the receivership moves would say there are so many other factors at play. It's not, that are things that the receivership wouldn't really solve. That's been an ongoing tension. But the state still felt that even with the funding limitations in these districts, even with the challenges these kids faced, that they could do better. And there was a lot of belief around that time in some circles that this kind of a move was one that states could or should make. And I mean, I was looking back at the time at what Chester said just earlier today, and he was both sort of bold and unapologetic about the move, but also a little humble. And when I wrote about this 10 years ago, I was looking back, he said, I approached this work with a tremendous amount of humility. I don't claim that we figured out how to turn around low-performing districts with a great deal of certainty, but I also approach it with a great sense of urgency, simply sitting back and hoping that if we let things run for another 2 years, maybe we'll see better results, is clearly not a strategy. So I think that the way they were really thinking about it is, we're not sure we have, that receivership is going to be this magic bullet, but what's happening now isn't working, and so it's worth a try. I think that's sort of the best way to think of it.
So how did this actually play out in practice? Because as noted, the reason that we're talking about this is Holyoke has come out of state receivership. So it's a really interesting kind of standalone case study here. So, what did the last 10 years involve? What kinds of changes to policy? What kinds of resource reallocations?
So they've been under the supervision of a state-appointed receiver. I think there have been two over the time, but for the bulk of these 10 years, it's been one individual, Anthony Soto, who actually was somebody who grew up in Holyoke, which is interesting because a lot of times people think of this as kind of the state swooping in and bringing some outsider in. So I think it was sort of a smart move on the state's part that they found someone who they felt some confidence in, who had real roots in Holyoke. But that didn't change the basic fundamentals that he had broad authority. The teachers union contract was essentially suspended. He was free to reassign teachers. He was free to dismiss teachers. He was free to dismiss administrators. They did set up a kind of performance-based compensation system, performance pay, which teachers unions have been very opposed to. And they made some other changes in increasing pre-K seats in the district. There was a redesign of the high school. I mean, it wasn't any one thing, but as the receiver would say and sort of testified, he was able to do a lot of things quickly and without, kind of getting bogged down in what sometimes was kind of what they would say was kind of an endless back and forth of fighting. So there were a lot of changes made, and the state points to certain outcomes like improved graduation rate, a higher rate at which students in the high school were taking advanced placement courses, and other outcomes. But to be honest, state officials really danced around the fundamental question, which was, are kids overall achieving at higher levels? And that is really the interesting thing to look at in this case and in receiverships generally across the country. And the answer is, on average, no.
So, as to that fundamental question that you point at here, the really significant one, which is, does this work at all? You noted in writing about the shift from Holyoke out of takeover status that there's still kind of both an acknowledgement that these aren't exactly silver bullet solutions for dealing with underperformance, but they do work in some ways or appear to. So, kind of give me the sort of high level on this. Does receivership do the things that proponents of receivership say it does?
Well, that it's a big question. I think the best way to answer it is to sort of roll back a couple of years. So there's a researcher who was formerly here in Massachusetts at Harvard, is now at the University of Virginia, named Beth Schuler. She and colleagues she's worked with have probably done among the most amount of research looking at the receivership question nationally. And a couple of years ago, they looked at receiverships across more than a dozen states, including Massachusetts, and they tried to sort of aggregate the results using kind of the greater statistical power that comes from looking at the experience of lots of students in lots of different states. And they concluded that on balance, state receivership does not appear to lead to increases in student achievement. So that was, frankly, a pretty important moment in this whole adventure, and one that was sobering to those who had sort of like Commissioner Chester a decade ago said, I'm not sure this is going to work, but what's happening now isn't working. I feel like an urgency to give it a try. So that was really the backdrop, and has been the backdrop over the last couple of years, as districts in like Holyoke have been clamoring to get back control of their schools. And so when the state, announced this decision, it was pretty notable that they did not claim great success in driving student achievement itself higher.
So you mentioned, of course, that teachers and other advocates in Holyoke had basically been saying we need to get out of state receivership. What were the actual issues that they were pointing to with the receivership system? Or were they saying it seems like we're kind of seeing enough progress that we think we don't really need to be observed or controlled in this way? Like, what did that period of years that you referred to actually look like from kind of the advocacy side to get out of receivership?
I mean, I think the argument really all along was just that it didn't appear to be making a demonstrable difference. And there really was just a strong argument about what they sort of would argue was sort of the fundamentally anti-democratic dimensions of this, that, every other district in the state, every other community is able to control and run its own schools, and that Holyoke, had been denied that for years now. And it was really kind of a classic case of a call for local control of schools.
And I'm glad that you also had brought up the union question as well, where teachers' unions had been very concerned about both the idea of receivership in general, kind of what you see in terms of teacher turnover when a district is under receivership, and then the idea that coming out of receivership doesn't necessarily mean a return to the structures that you saw beforehand. So where were the unions and what were the teacher concerns on this front? Are they still worried?
Yeah, they're worried and they're not happy because, in fact, although the district has been returned to local control, the state hasn't quite released the reins completely. So the current receiver is gonna serve for another year as the superintendent there, at least. So the state is allowing the receiver to continue to have broader powers over teachers' contract issues. And so they're kind of easing their way back to full local control. So the teachers union has frankly not been happy with this announcement, although not that they didn't want the receivership to end, but they think that this move has not gone far enough to fully return the schools to local control.
Yeah, it is sort of funny. I was trying to think about how to talk about the nature of where they are at in the transition because it's not as quickly as kind of what we had turned on this lever and now we're turning it back off again. So when you're thinking about what the current status is of Holyoke, is it that they are in the process of exiting receivership, but they aren't there yet? Like, is that what most people understand would be the case when a school is cleared to leave receivership?
I think that's right. I mean, it is hard to sort of turn the switch and have everything return as it was. Although one thing that's interesting is Holyoke has had a school committee throughout all this time, and they've continued to elect people to a school committee that essentially has had no power. At times, you could raise questions about why they were doing that because there was this body that met and talked about the schools, but really had no control over it. But in this period now, as they've been getting ready to return to local control, it's made a lot of sense to have these folks, sort of in office, ready to take the reins. And the state's been doing some trainings with them on some of the governance issues that I think state officials thought were particularly challenging there. So it is kind of a transition that's taking place.
So we've talked about the ways that receivership sort of falls short or doesn't necessarily fulfill on kind of the grand promise of we can come in, we can tool around with these local systems, and we'll leave you with a better performing district afterward, if you ever get to afterward. But you've also looked at more recent research on, is there something that's almost a blend? Can receivership ever improve things at the local level at all, even if it's not kind of on this huge sweeping scale that's often promised?
Right. I think this is the same researcher from the University of Virginia who's kind of the sort of takeover specialist, if you will, in education research circles, Beth Schuler. She and some colleagues were interested following their earlier paper that showed overall, if you look at all the state takeovers, you don't see kind of a clear net benefit. But that lack of a net benefit is really the aggregate result of some districts that showed positive results, some that didn't. So they wondered, is it just random that, it kind of works out some places, not in others. Overall, it's kind of a bust. Or is there something really about the ones where it seemed to get more traction that they could zero in on that, again, would be helpful for policy going forward? So they looked at actually districts in this new paper here, just in Massachusetts. There are 3 districts under state receivership: Holyoke, Lawrence, which happened earlier, and a much smaller district of Southbridge. And they also added a 4th district, which was a chunk of schools within the Springfield school system that have been under sort of a quasi receivership status. And so they tried to look at these 4 districts, and what they found is that the Springfield, what is called an empowerment zone, and the Lawrence schools have both shown some modest improvements over this time. In contrast, Southbridge and Holyoke were two that really have shown no real positive results on achievement. And what the researchers noted was that in both Lawrence and in Springfield, there's been some degree of sort of local voice in the state-run authorities there, and that their hypothesis, it's they don't feel they've really proven anything, but they're just proposing the idea that maybe, I don't want to call it like receivership light, but a receivership that doesn't completely steamroll over kind of the local voice in it might have a better chance of getting traction. Whether, again, they're not at all sure of why. Maybe it just kind of gives local folks more of a sense of being part of the solution, and therefore kind of leads to different outcomes. Maybe there's some degree to which the local big shots come in, and they don't, as what people locally would say, is they don't really understand things here or know everything. Well, if you allow local people to be kind of have somewhat of a seat at that table, maybe they can steer some of the interventions and decisions in ways that work out better. So I think it's sort of something, at least for people who think that these takeovers are not a total bust, they can kind of hang their hat on the idea that there may still be ways going forward to think about doing that.
It does seem to get at a sort of broad question about what the state is really for in these situations. Because, of course, in the districts that we're talking about here, they're often described as, they're struggling to, as, gain traction in kind of finding that improvement, or there's been persistently problematic or difficult local management, so that they are kind of very mired in these cycles of poor performance. And so the question that's been interesting, because to me at least, because a lot of this has been around the idea of, should the state be involved at all, or should the state not be involved at all, as opposed to the idea of, how do you define the idea that maybe there needs to be sort of a moving force, but not necessarily a complete takeover. And so I wonder what you've seen in kind of covering this on the way that local officials have talked about, was it a good idea for the state to sort of get involved in some way? And then, of course, thinking about it from the teachers union side, sort of saying, like, actually, they just shouldn't.
Right. Well, I do think that, one thing that's interesting on that score to sort of note is that as much as the officials in Holyoke were clamoring to get control back and welcoming it, the mayor of Holyoke, Josh Garcia, was actually a member of the school committee back 10 years ago or so. And as he's been welcoming this return to local control, he also was honest in saying, at the time, the takeover was probably the right thing to do. So I think it's interesting that we haven't really seen a big, clear increase in student achievement. But I think the sort of harder to sort of define problems, the dysfunction, the lack of kind of clear management direction that the state also felt was kind of hampering the schools, is something that even the current mayor is acknowledging now was at play. So I think that, again, I think it sounds like he and others are not really going so far as to say, this nightmare is over, it was a disaster and a mistake from the start, they should have never done it. But it's sort of a conundrum if people are saying it probably was necessary, but then it's hard to say it's really kind of achieved all the things that one had hoped for. I think one thing in that vein worth noting is that I talked recently with Paul Revell, who had been the state education secretary back at the time this law in 2010 was passed, and was really one of the architects of this law that gave the state the ability to go in and take over schools. And when you talk to him today, Paul is now teaching at the Harvard Education School, spending a lot of time thinking about these things. And he feels like it's still an important tool, but he also is quick to say that we increasingly understand that these kinds of moves within a school district itself are not going to be enough to move the needle. I mean, he's just kind of has a growing appreciation for the broader impacts of poverty, housing insecurity, health insecurity, all the other factors in kids' lives that really hold them back. So it's interesting that he, as the person who was really the architect of this law, is still defending it, but is very quick to say, any idea that this alone would be the kind of key to getting Holyoke students, fully on track or getting them performing at levels like those of kids in other, more affluent districts is just, that's not the case. And that we can't let these kind of superpower, aggressive intervention moves by the state take away from the need for us to really pay attention to a much broader set of needs that these districts had. So he would say it's it's not an either or, it's a both and sort of situation.
So where does this leave us as you're watching the way that the state handles receivership in other districts, which are still held under receivership? What are you watching? Do you think that there's going to be kind of a mass reconsideration? Do you think that there's sort of still going to be a slow roll on how the state approaches kind of the schools under its care, auspices, control? What are you most interested in dynamics wise looking ahead now that Holyoke is out?
Well, I think there is a question of whether the legislature is going to sort of dip their toes in it all. There's certainly been a push from the state teachers unions to to scrap the provision of this law that allows for receivership. They would do away with it entirely. I don't know that that's something that there's an appetite for in the legislature. I don't think the governor has an appetite for it, but I'm not sure that we're going to see, other districts, put in receivership anytime soon. The state hasn't done that for quite a number of years. We now have the first one exit. I think there's going to be sort of attention now is going to focus on Lawrence and Southbridge and say, if Holyoke was ready to return, why aren't they yet ready, or what would it take for them to be ready? And I think there will be, because of the evidence we've had about the pretty limited, evidence of strong results from it. I think there's going to be, Mitchell Chester talked about approaching this with humility 10 years ago. I think there's maybe going to be even a little more humility, which I think kind of translates into caution on the part of the state before they rush to put other districts in this same situation over the next period of time.
All right. Well, that's all the time we've got. Michael Jonas, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Michael Jonas for joining me on the Codcast this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.